Fire remains one of the largest risks to personal and commercial property. The insurance industry relies heavily on data to assess potential exposures to losses from fire. But until now, we've been missing some important insights. We can turn to the UK for some inspiration and hopefully new approaches to risk assessment and mitigation we can apply in the United States. I'm thrilled to welcome John Bonney to the virtual main event today. John served in the UK Fire Service for 33 years and eventually became Chief of Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. During that time, he developed a model that improved the safety of the local community and was honored as Commander of the Order of the British Empire in recognition of his service to the public. John now consults clients in the United Kingdom and the US. John, thanks for joining us this morning.
Phil, it's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be able to join the conference. You said something about the use of data and intelligence to sort of drive your own industry. And I think there's some real common themes with the story that I want to tell today about the UK Fire and Rescue Service and how it might apply in the US as well. So, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. I thought what might be useful was just to start off with a short video, which covers a couple of minutes. It covers my whole career, actually, from the early 80s right through to the mid-2000s, 2010, actually. And it gives you a bit of a flavour for what happened in the UK over that period of time. So if you're okay, we'll run the video and people can get just a chance to see the journey that the UK Fire and Rescue Service embarked upon.
John, that sounds great. Let's let it roll.
We are Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service. Over the last few decades, the fire service has changed. Back in the 1980s, firefighters attended a lot of fires and other incidents. We did an excellent job of dealing with those fires and rescuing people. As we worked through the 90s, we were very successful in getting people to fit smoke alarms in their homes. As a result of this, many fires were detected faster, meaning property damage and loss of life were reduced. We didn't stop there. In the new millennium, we started visiting people's houses, not to just promote smoke alarm ownership, but to educate people on how they could prevent fires occurring. And we went to lots of homes and met lots of people. By 2010, we came to understand that older people were more vulnerable than others. So we focused our attention on these people. As we approached 2015, we identified a clear relationship between our risk groups and those prone to slips, trips, falls, and ill health. So what's all this leading to? The answer is Safe and Well. Safe and Well aims to improve the health, well-being and safety of the people in our community. From the usual fire safety advice to health interventions such as falling hazards or providing safety equipment. The data we collect allows us to better target at-risk people and improve what we do nationally. But why are firefighters expected to start doing this? Firefighters are trusted and respected in communities and have access to vulnerable people that other agencies just don't have. This unique access allows us to address problems directly and do more of the all-important prevention that we know works so well. And it doesn't stop there. A strong Safe and Well strategy helps our colleagues in partner agencies, reduces workloads on health services, saves public money, and above all, keeps people safe in their homes and communities. So, keep an eye out for more updates from us over the coming months as we continue to keep our Hampshire residents safe and well. Thanks for watching.
John, you want to tell us more about the shift in addressing risk in the UK?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. I think the video gives you a bit of a sense of the journey. In truth, though, the real driver behind the change occurs in the early 2000s. And that was driven really by our own central government. Unlike arrangements in the US, central government in the UK has policy responsibility for fire, and therefore they're able to mandate things. And in mandating, they made a number of specific requests in the early 2000s. And the graphic I want to show you now gives you a bit of a sense of that. So prior to this new direction from central government, the UK Fire and Rescue Service concentrated very much on delivering against a set of prescribed standards. So these standards were very pedestrian in one sense. They were the speed and weight of response. So it was very much looking at inputs rather than outcomes. What this new mandate required of Fire and Rescue Services was to develop their own local safety plan, something we hadn't had before. So this was a safety plan which had to be tailored to our own communities. It had to assess the risk to life, and that was risk to life, not just from fire, but any type of incident we might attempt. To then analyze that assessment, and analysis was, again, something that we really hadn't done, and then deploy all our resources to improve all sections of society. Now, if you think about that, there's something inherent in there about improving all sections of society, because actually what it was saying, what it was inferring was that risk affects different parts of our society in a different way, something we'd never even looked at before. So what you see here is a new mandate that requires us to use data and intelligence to drive the service that we offer. I just want to show you this other graphic. One of the things I say to clients both in the UK and the US is that actually that mandate required us to completely change our business model. It's not language that's very familiar to public service to talk about changing their business model, but it was so fundamental that it was a tectonic shift for us. And what it said was, stop thinking about the risk itself, the fire, the road traffic collision, the hazmat, the incident, and look at the drivers behind that risk. And what we discovered was, when we started to look at the data, things like health vulnerability, things like the demographic profile of our community, the socioeconomic makeup of it, the levels of criminality, and even educational achievement, all those things would influence the risk in different parts of the community.
And I understand you've developed your own risk model?
Yeah. I think one of the things that we discovered is it's such a fundamental change that people need a bit of a few stepping stones to find a way forward. So my own company developed a model, and this is a simplified version in the graphic you can see here. The first thing it said is, well, what do we know? What do we know as fire and rescue services? And interestingly, fire and rescue services, both in the UK and in the US, collect enormous amounts of data. Types of incidents, the times of those incidents, where they occur, very important. We'll come back to that about where they occur. And we'll break that information down. In truth, we're not particularly good at using that information. We collect lots of it, but I'm not sure, until fairly recently, we knew a lot of what to do with it. But if you take that data about what we know and start to look at what other people know about our community, so maybe other public sector agencies, maybe health, maybe police, maybe even other bodies that hold proprietary data like census data or even some commercial data. And if we put that information together, it allows us to draw some conclusions. What we say is, what does this tell us? And we can draw some assumptions about the data and what's behind the risk. Not a common word for fire and rescue service to use, but what we're effectively saying is we'll set a hypothesis. Let's set up a hypothesis and then test it by planning and deploying our resources, whatever they are, not just community education, but regulatory services, response, anything that we have to test that hypothesis. Is it true? And then we can evaluate and learn. And in that way, we create a model that helps us use data to better understand risk and take action against that risk.
Okay, John, that is the theory which you've just explained in your model. How is that working in the real world?
Well, you're absolutely right, Phil. It's all well and good at having models to use, but fire and rescue services on both sides of the Atlantic tend to work in very concrete ways, and they'll want to see how this translates into the real world. Let me show you a graphic that sort of illustrates how that plays out. And this is a piece of work that was done about 3 or 4 years ago in southwest England, an area that covers about 7 million people. And they did a piece of research about fire deaths and factors that were prevalent in those particular types of incidents. And they discovered that the presence of mental health, there was often poor housekeeping, there was alcohol and drug abuse, the prevalence of smoking. There was often limited mobility, and even living alone. And often those incidents would have maybe 1, 2, 3, even 4 of those factors present. And in that way, if you know that those factors are likely to occur, then that becomes a predictive model for you to say, that's where we need to put our attention. These are the people that we need to focus upon.
All right, John, you've given us some observations of what you've seen in the UK. What about the US? Are you seeing anything similar?
Oh, absolutely, Phil. And a really good question, because there's a bit of a sense that we say, well, actually, this just applies in the UK and it's not directly transferable. This graphic I want to put up now illustrates just the strength of the parallels between the UK and the US. One is a piece of research that was taken in Northumberland in the northeast part of England, and the other one is the state of Tennessee, undertaken by the State Fire Marshal's Office. Both were looking at factors that occurred in serious fires, the drivers behind. So in the UK, areas that had the lowest property value, areas that had the prevalence of social housing, and where people lived in the lowest income band would have a disproportionate amount of these types of fires. Similarly, in the US, what the Fire Marshal's Office discovered was those areas that were in the lowest 10% median household value, the lowest 10% median household income, and the lowest 10% of educational achievement exhibited exactly the same types of incidents. So there's direct parallels between our two societies in relation to those who are going to be most vulnerable for particular types of incidents.
Interesting. And what is the value of other types of data you can bring into this type of analysis?
Yeah, that's right. Because as fire and rescue services, I think previously, often what we would do is we would tend to collect our own data and try and work with that. And actually, increasingly, there is huge amounts of data that is held by our partners and is held often in places that we don't expect to find real value. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. One of the things that UK Fire and Rescue Services discovered quite quickly is that there is a plethora of information about different segments of their communities. The different lifestyle segments that can be identified and used is of real value to fire and rescue services. Some of your colleagues will probably be familiar with Esri's mosaic. Esri's tapestry. There's a number of different ones. Mosaic from Experian, Acorn. And what these do is these are principally marketing tools that look at different lifestyles and break down those segments in our communities to look at the demographics, to look at ethnicity, income, where those people work, who is influencing those people. Now, that's actually hugely valuable to fire and rescue services. If we put our data, what we know about incidents, together with that lifestyle data and overlay it, because it's both geospatially mapped, we can actually plot where particular lifestyle groups are, knowing who is most vulnerable. And the graphic shows this. For a particular type of incidents, you can see certain lifestyles that are heavily overrepresented in terms of risk, and other lifestyles which are heavily underrepresented. We need to target those, obviously, that are most vulnerable. Now, in the UK, we can go down to household level, as the graphic shows. We can actually identify individual households. In the US, you can't do that. Privacy laws prevent that occurring. But the very fact that you can get down census blocks is more than adequate when you're starting. And a number of US and Canadian departments are now starting to use lifestyle data to actually identify and predict who's most at risk. There's one other thing I'd add to that, Phil, is this is marketing data. So it's not just about prediction. This is about routes to market. How do you get to influence those people? And that lifestyle data gives you clues to that. In this graphic, it could be, for instance, that it's best that you do a visit. You, as the fire department, does the visit. Otherwise, it might be using literature that's absolutely for a particular segment. Otherwise, it might be working with your partners, not to just share data now, but to deliver safety services. Or it might even be social media for particular groups that have particular risks in relation to, say, students or whatever. So as a route to market and as a predictive tool, lifestyle data is hugely valuable to us.
What are some of the other insights this approach you've been taking has revealed?
That's a great question, Phil, because my work in the US has illustrated that this is not just about looking at risk in the traditional sense, fires and road traffic collisions, but looking at other data sets that give us clues to risk that we never even thought about. So what I want to show you here appears to be a fairly innocuous statistic, but is actually hugely important and has a direct relevance to your industry, to the insurance industry. So the graphic I want to put up looks at automatic fire alarms that runs from about 2000 to 2014. The data is a little bit old here, but the trajectories continue on these courses. So the first thing you can say is that unusually the US and the UK are diverging. The numbers of automatic fire alarms has risen in that 15-year period by 47% in the US and dropped by 45% in the UK. But in both cases, there's a lot of those types of calls. Now, these may be malicious, but usually they're caused by some alarm malfunction or poor housekeeping or just poor maintenance generally. So there's a lot of these calls. Now, you might think, well, at least they're not fires. The next graphic, though, starts to illustrate when you look at the data, you can learn an awful lot more, and it has some quite grave implications for us. So the first thing is that automatic fire alarms average out in any 1 year in our two countries twice as many incident calls as fires. Sometimes it's nearly 3 times as many. So that's a lot of calls. That's over 2.5 million in the US and about 300,000 in the UK. Somewhere between 93 and 95% in both our countries are false actuations. So they are not actual fires. They are a fault. Of the 7 to 5% remaining, less than 10% requires any significant action by fire and rescue services. So in effect, what that means is that we're attending, in the US, somewhere in the region of 2.5 million calls where no action is being taken. Now, if you look further, then the data starts to illustrate something more significant. In the UK, the most common cause of death amongst emergency responders is driving to or from the incident. In the US, it's the second most frequent cause of death amongst firefighters. Nobody has done the research in terms of other road users who are killed or seriously injured as a result of a collision with a fire truck, but it is not insubstantial. The other factor that we know is that if we attend in the normal way that we have been these false alarms, little action is taken by the crews who attend. Little action is taken, and certainly no action is taken to prevent a reoccurrence. So in one sense, what we're doing here is we are creating more of a risk by our responding in the traditional way than if we were to look at it differently and actually reduce the risk of our response and match proportionally resource to risk. And it can be done. What happened in the UK is we started to look at what we were sending to these incidents, what they were doing where they get there, so that actually we can spend time dealing with these incidents so that we can prevent a reoccurrence. And that was usually one person attending, not 3 or 4 or 5 trucks attending, simply because they weren't needed.
Gentlemen, what are the wider implications of taking this type of approach?
Yeah, thanks for that, Phil. I think there's some huge implications. A lot of my clients in the US start with the nuts and bolts, but what they quickly realize is that this is an organizational change as much as it is about trying to just deliver community safety or community risk reduction. And what I mean by that is, in the strap line to my presentation, I said, there's a version 1 fire and rescue services, a version 2. And what I mean by that is, I think if we went back to the early 2000s, both in the UK and the US, fire services tended to have a much heavier focus on capital assets and capital investment, trucks, buildings. There was a preoccupation with inputs and occasionally outputs. And that was driven partly by prescribed standards, but it was also driven by assessment methodologies. And you will be familiar in your own country that some of the assessment methodologies actually focus almost entirely on inputs. There was hierarchical decision-making, and that was because the business model was fixed. They didn't need to have any challenge to it, so it's a legitimate way of doing business. The culture tended to be quite closed, so there was very little work with partners beyond at sea. And there was technology, and there was use of some clever technology, but it tended to be fairly tactical. It tended to be at service delivery point. Run forward 15 years, and certainly in the UK, and there are good examples in the US beginning to emerge, where fire departments become much more information intensive. They're focusing on outcomes. And because they're focusing on outcomes, they're able to demonstrate value, particularly in the political arena. This is the value of what we're achieving. They're much more collaborative. They'll work with partners to get information, but also deliver services. Information is more spread, so their knowledge powers become much more important rather than just rank and position. And the culture tends to be much more open and learning. The organizations that have been very successful in this, in my own country and increasingly in the US, have a culture which is one where they're willing to experiment and learn, but also be honest about what's worked and what hasn't worked. And finally, a strategic use of technology. And what I mean by that really is that the technology is used to inform decision-making. The analytics are being used to inform corporate decisions about where resources are being put. The impact overall can be demonstrated in this graphic. From the early 2000s in the UK, primary fires, which are principally structure fires, have dropped dramatically. They're beginning to plateau out in the last 3 or 4 years, and therein, I think, lies another conversation that we could have at another stage. But the impact is insured residential fire losses have reduced from about £575 million in 2002 down to £350 million in 2018, and that's rebased against 2018. So that's a substantial drop.
Yes. So where are we in the U.S. on this type of approach?
Um, so I think if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, I'd have dodged the question a bit, and I'd have said, "Oh, well, it's early days and everything." What I am able to say, I think, is that there's been substantial progress in the last 5 years. Certainly, in the period that I've been working in the US, I've seen the levels of understanding of this and adoption of some of these initiatives has grown enormously. I think it's really significant that this year there is for the first time an NFPA standard 1300 on community risk assessment and community risk reduction, which is all about what we've been talking about. And those standards, as we know, don't emerge overnight. That's the result of a professional change that's begun to develop, I would suggest, in the last 4 or 5 years. I put this graphic up because in one sense, I see the sector both as a professional sector and as a market for myself. The arrow on the left-hand side, I would say, is where we were in maybe about 2015. There were some noticeable front runners who were doing some very interesting work, fairly unconnected with each other, because there wasn't that many other people doing this amount of work. So these were real innovators. I think in the last 5 years, we've seen a shift to the right in this curve, and that we've started to see beyond the early adopters now, and there is a majority view beginning, still fairly nascent, that this is the way that they need to go in the future. I think it's got huge implications for your own sector, in the sense that fire departments, as they get much more information savvy, will be looking to work much more closely with your colleagues to, if you like, deliver the same outcomes, which is safer, better protected communities.
Are there any specific examples that you can reference, fire departments in the U.S. that kind of stick out as leaders in this regard?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think we've seen some great work done by Rancho Cucamonga, who is in California. Los Angeles City has done some interesting work recently. Tualatin Valley in Oregon. San Bernardino now is starting to do some very good work. Austin in Texas. And Surrey, British Columbia. The Canadians are moving quickly in this area. And they have some fine work that we can all learn from.
Well, thank you so much for all your time and insights regarding the changing landscape of fire risk in the UK, which seems to be also moving our direction in the US, which I think is a great sign of things to come in changing fire risk for insurers in the US as well. Appreciate your time today, John.
Phil, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.